Hi everyone and welcome to this LFF Screen Talk, and it's my immense pleasure to invite Riz Ahmed onto, not really the stage, but onto the screen. Hey Riz, how are you doing?
Hey man, good to see you.
Excellent. So this is going to be a bit of a career overview, but what I'm interested in, because of my own personal experience growing up in London, was when I watched films as a young Asian kid growing up on the estate, I didn't even really I didn't know who filmmakers were or how films worked. Even that I wanted to get involved in film. What kind of age did you know that music and film and entertainment was something you wanted to pursue?
Well, I always knew these were things that I loved. I just really did not think that they were possible for me to pursue. So, and I think that's for multiple reasons, right? One of them is the internalized kind of limitations that we place on ourselves, or which are understandable, actually. You could call them limitations, or you could call them kind of like, good GPS. Like, if your parents are kind of, immigrants and they come to this country and they want to find stability for their kids, then I think they're quite wise to kind of like, push them more towards stable professions. You got the classics, the greatest hits, doctor, engineer, whatever. But so there was, to some extent, there was just that narrative that was always in the background. But there's also the external narrative that's actually much more powerful and insidious, which is this idea of not seeing yourself reflected in the culture. If you don't see yourself reflected in a culture, then you kind of internalize this idea that you don't belong in it. You internalize this idea that your story or your contribution to the culture would not be valued. And so there's that, those limitations that might be in the house or in your own culture, and then out there in the kind of wider culture on screen and on billboards and on the radio. But in terms of my own personal passion for these things, from day one, really, with hip hop, it was really, I always idolized my older brother. He was into rap. He had all these kind of cassettes. It was the golden age of hip hop. It was 92, 93, 94. And he told me specifically, listen, don't listen to these cassettes. I've got swearing on them. So as a 10, 11-year-old kid, I instantly would memorize all of them as soon as he left the house. So that was what was going on with that. And I just always appreciated really, to be honest, as a kid who was kind of quite ADD, the hyperactivity of it, the athleticism of it. I used to listen to rappers like DOC, for example, or, with the advent of jungle, just how fast and intense and energetic it was. As a hyperactive kid, if I grew up in the States, I probably would have been prescribed Ritalin or something like that, to kind of calm me down. And so that's what it was. It was kind of quite a cathartic outlet for me, the music. The acting, I gotta say, it's probably down to my uncle's poor babysitting skills. When we'd be left alone with our uncles, they just put on Nightmare on Elm Street. We're like 6, 7 years old, just watching like gory horror films, and a lot of Bruce Lee, which I think was actually quite impactful to see, a male lead action hero who isn't white, speaking another language, and everyone thinks he's amazing. What Bruce Lee achieved is unbelievable, really, to become a global star like that in foreign language, movies. And what I started doing from a really early age is making my own films in my head, not on camera. You hear about Christopher Nolan going like, kid, I'd just be like on Super 8, and I was like, no, what I had was my Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles exercise book and a pencil, and I'd watch a film, and then I would spend like a couple of days just scene by scene acting out my own rip-off version of that film, just around the house, just like, again, just hyperactive, just smashing up chairs and doing stunts, jumping off the bunk bed. And at the end of that filmmaking process of like 2 days, I would give the film a title and a rating. They would all be 18 because it'd be hyper violent. And so this is kind of how I filled my childhood, memorizing rap lyrics and acting out films. I just never thought that I could realistically pursue it as a career.
And was your friendship group very different to your home group? I remember for me, my life outside the house was like so British, which is clearly what I am. But my life at home, I always felt was this traditional cavern that I was going back to all the time and trying to escape from. How was it for you?
Well, for me, I wouldn't say that there was a sense of wanting to escape from home personally. It was just that there were different environments. And it's often older siblings that bridge that gap, right? Your parents are from a different time and place, quite literally, and they can guide you with love and they clothe you and feed you. You know, I was very lucky to have very supportive, nurturing, loving parents, but there will always be that generational gap where things will be lost in translation. You know, and so your older siblings kind of take on that parental role of people who can, you know, I would see my English friends having that kind of friendly relationship with their parents where they could talk to them about who they're dating and what's going on at school and talk about the same music that they're listening to and watching the same films, which I think a lot of children of immigrants don't have. You know, we have other things. We have this enriching kind of, you know, immense cultural heritage that comes with us. And we have this totally different palette to paint with and different goggles to see the world with and, you know, competing narratives to the dominant ones. You know, whenever you turn on the news, there's a DVD commentary at home, which is always at odds with what the BBC might be showing, for example. So, you know, we have other things, but that gap was real, but there were ways of bridging that gap. And I think for me, it was about my siblings. You know, I think there was that code switching element that I talk about a lot, and that I made a short film about called Daytimer, which is about a kid who goes to his first Asian daytime rave, which was a big thing in the 90s. You know, Asian girls weren't allowed out at night still a lot of times, so things were a bit more traditional. And so, you know, we'd have our raves in the daytime. Basically, people would skip off school and, you know, change your clothes and no one would be any the wiser when you got home. But in Daytimer, I show that code switching between really three worlds. One was the school, which was very kind of traditional British. It was a private school. And then then you've got the home environment, which was, you know, more Urdu speaking and, you know, cultural values a bit different, and, you know, it's a Pakistani household, and there's a big kind of difference, I guess, class-wise between one setting and the other. And then the third world was was that kind of like Asian rude boy scene in, like, you know, the mid-90s. I feel like we've seen the emergence of more of a brown middle class now in the 21st century. And I think there are many different ways of being brown. You know, you can be Rishi Sunak, you can be, you know, so many different things. You can be who you want to be a bit more. And I think at that time it was still more likely than not to be a working class experience. And I think the templates for Asian masculinity were really taken from the African American experience. And, you know, Tupac, you know, everyone wanted to be Tupac, and it was that, and so it was a kind of, you know, I think, you know, this was a time when you had a lot of, I guess you could say, kind of inter-ethnic gang rivalries as well, particularly in West London, with, you know, you had kind of Sikh gangs in Southall and Muslim gangs in Hounslow, and it was that kind of scene. It had a kind of Rumblefish kind of element to it, you know, if you've seen that film or the book. And so that was a third world. And so kind of pinballing between these three worlds was what kind of defined my adolescence. Yeah.
I remember, speaking of those influences, I remember my excitement when I first heard like Apache Indian. That was so great for me. I was like, wow, someone doing it, much as it might be a little bit problematic. But for you, when was the moment that it went from being these films that you were making at home inside your head that were all 18s to being something that you were pursuing a little bit more professionally?
Well, something happened when I was at university, which is the National Student Drama Festival sends these scouts over to see plays of student plays, and they pick out actors in the plays, or they pick out the plays themselves, and they go to this festival in Scarborough. And I got selected from that, and I got to go up, and I spent this week up there, and it really opened my eyes to, this whole group of young people from across the country. And for them, that theater was their life. Drama was their life, acting was their life. And I'd never allowed myself to see it that way, or I'd never been allowed to see it that way. The emphasis was more on academia and a more traditional route. And it kind of blew my mind. And I just realized that, wow, you could just do this all the time. And so, about a year later, when people were applying for jobs, I couldn't find the motivation to really apply. I did apply in a very kind of half-assed way for certain jobs, but I thought, you know what, let me apply to a drama school. And interestingly, it was it was someone at Oxford with me, one of the few Black British women in my whole year at Oxford University, who I'd got to know through, we did this thing called the Access Scheme, where you kind of work to make Oxford more inclusive and bringing in kids from diverse backgrounds. And she emailed me. We weren't even that close, but in the way that you kind of nod at someone who you see around, you're like, yeah. And she said, listen, I hope you're going to be pursuing your acting. And that was the first person who specifically and explicitly said to me, you can do this, you should do this. And I thought, really? I mean, what am I going to play? Just shopkeeper number 7 or and I thought, you know what, let me apply to one drama school and see if I get in. And I got in and I couldn't afford it. And again, I just went, let me apply for one scholarship fund. And if I don't get it, then I'll forget it. And I got that. And then I still didn't have enough. And then a theatre producer called Thelma Holt, who puts together this tour of Japan that the drama students do at Oxford every year. She heard about my situation, and she basically hooked up. There was a couple of grand I needed, and she hooked it up. It was just ridiculous luck, and also luck that came from being in a privileged situation of having been at Oxford and found myself in that setting. And I just kind of shudder a little bit to think about the people that were just undoubtedly the incredible talent that we lose every year, that doesn't have, even me finding myself in that position of privilege, there were so many internal and external hurdles that I had to overcome to pursue this as a viable career. And there's undoubtedly just thousands and thousands of people who, are not able to overcome those hurdles, who don't have that alignment of luck and privilege. So yeah, that's kind of how I applied to drama school and got in, and then that was that, yeah.
And then afterwards, as well as in addition to access, there's a question of confidence. And what I always was struck by immediately when post 9/11 blues hit, which was the first time I was aware of you, was that it takes confidence to have this message and to speak out and say what you did on that record. Where did that come from?
So post 9/11 blues, for people who don't know, was my first bit of music that I put out, and it was kind of like a joke rap song about the post 9/11 circus of fear and prejudice and paranoia. And where it came from is finding myself in the role of a clown in that circus. It came from the reality. You could look at it as social commentary or satire, but it was actually quite personal. It was I've started a career as an actor. Guess what all the roles are I'm being asked to play? Being all asked to play terrorists. Okay, I don't want to do that. I get to do Road to Guantanamo, which was a dream job for me. It was my first acting job. I actually left drama school early to take it because it was a combination of kind of improvised acting, and all my training had been Shakespeare, so this felt a bit more edgy and contemporary, but also, an issue that I really cared about, which was the, illegal detentions in Guantanamo Bay, which really kind of hit home for me in terms of the kind of world we were moving into. And I was very, very grateful and very lucky for Michael Winterbottom to start my career really and put me in that role and give me that incredible experience. But on the way back from Berlin Film Festival, where again, we were lucky to win an award, on the way back from that festival, I mean, we all got detained by British intelligence officers, who always say that it must be named ironically because they were just doing the stupidest stuff. They were just taking us into this side room, putting us in physical kind of arm locks and, you know, jabbing their fingers in our face saying, did you become an actor to further the Muslim struggle? And all this kind of crazy stuff going through our phones, being super threatening. There's like 3 of them on you and pretending they were able to do this legally, but I knew my rights enough to know this was bullshit. And it was after that, I just went like, wow, this is like, you couldn't make this up. Like a bunch of actors acting in a film about illegal detention are illegally detained on the way back from winning an award for this film about illegal detention. It's like, and I remember, you know, at the time, a lot of the Guantanamo lawyers, Gareth Pearce and Clive Stafford Smith, who were really helpful, and Clive, you know, wrote about my experience in the New Statesman. They were saying, look, let's do a press conference in Parliament about this. You can sue the government for this. And so many people get harassed like this, but they won't have a chance in the platform to talk about their experience. You have, because of this film. And the kind of crazy, delicious irony of it from the point of view of newspapers. And I just said, you know, I don't want the first time I'm on TV to be like as a victim. I don't want to do that. And so I wrote that song. And so that song came directly from feeling like, okay, I am in an absurdist circus of post 9/11 kind of paranoia, you know, a circus of fear. And I'm a clown in this circus, it seems, you know, so let me give you a clown show. And that's what post 9/11 blues was. It came from that experience.
And how did your experience, you say it was a great experience on the road to Guantanamo making the film. How did that high-low hit you, where you had won an award at Berlin, and then you go back, you had this experience, but then the film came out and it was very much well-received, and your performance as Shafiq was noted by a lot of people as a great debut?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it was a kind of life-changing experience, right? It's like the first acting job, to first professional job, but also it wasn't like a job. It was like that classic Winterbottom observational documentary style drama where there was no script. I was the only kind of like actor in it, but you know, amongst the boys. But it was my first acting job. I didn't have a clue what I was doing, and the other cast members were all from Birmingham, from kind of local kind of colleges to the area of where the real Tipton 3 were from. And so really it was a road trip with 3 new best mates, just driving through Afghanistan, stoned off your face, being kind of intermittently shackled and thrown into cages, and then going home with cuts everywhere, and getting up the next day and feeling sick and then throwing up into a bucket, but Michael's filming you while you are actually throwing up into the bucket. It was just this crazy adventure. It really was a crazy adventure. And it just opened my eyes in so many ways. It opened my eyes to what acting was. You know, I was so grateful for, you know, Michael's incredible editor and editing skills in just taking all this kind of Shakespearean acting that I thought was acting and just using all the bits where I didn't know the camera was on, pretty much, you know. And it opened my eyes to what, you know, it was the first time I was on a film set, but it opened my eyes to just the world that is out there. You know, I think it really stayed with me. My first experience as a professional actor on a film was one that took me to Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. And I feel like I owe something to those places. You know, they're kind of ingrained into the DNA of like my career or what I'm kind of expressing as a performer. So in a way it was quite grounding and anchoring for me in not getting just swept up and lost in a kind of tide of deracination, you know, which I think is very easy to happen if you're from certain communities, finding yourself in entertainment, finding yourself in predominantly white spaces and middle class or upper class spaces even, or, you know, where the only two binaries that you're often offered are be the terrorist or be someone called Bob, and there's no mention of your reality and your experience. And so I think it kind of, just going to those countries, the people we met, the adventures we went on, it was still, I'd say, kind of the trip of a lifetime, you know.
Yeah. And then jumping forward a couple of years later, almost going back to what you said earlier about Asian gangs, even though you were not playing in an Asian gang, you did this terrific performance in Shifty for Aaron Creevy, where you play this young drug dealer, but it really captured a situation and a mood, and it showed your development as an actor. How is that experience that you remember?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm just super indebted to Aaron for multiple reasons. So Road to Guantanamo, Post 9/11 Blues, and Shifty are kind of almost sit under the same banner because they were similar filmmakers. So Road to Guantanamo is co-directed by Michael Winterbottom and Matt Whitecross. And then the Post 9/11 Blues music video was directed by Matt Whitecross and Aaron Creevy. And on that shoot, I met Aaron, and then he put me in Shifty. So it was this kind of weird pass the parcel of Riz across these projects. And I got to say, I loved it. It was a hilarious experience. So many of those kind of early films where no one's getting paid a penny and it's all hands on deck and we're just all in it together because we love this project. They're some of the most enjoyable experiences you can ever hope to have as an artist if it goes right, you know. And it's down to, I think, Aaron's leadership on set, that he set such a beautiful, playful, collaborative tone, whilst also being meticulous in rehearsal. It was in many ways, I mean, it was my, you know, that and Brits were like my first experiences with like, okay, do something with a script. Do you know what I mean? Because I'd done Road to Guantanamo and then I was doing this. And I was also hugely grateful to Danny Mays, you know. Danny Mays was, you know, much more established than me, a lot more experience, and he was very kind to me, you know, and he was very welcoming and open. And similarly with Jason Fleming, you know, it can always go multiple directions when you're like this new kid on a film set and you've got all this stuff to do, and you know, people can get tense and, you know, you've got limited time and egos, but it just wasn't like that at all. And I'd say that's just down to Aaron, you know, and I would say that that's a lesson I've learned again and again, is the tone is set at the top every time. You know, if the director and the main producers, the main actor are giving off a certain energy, that energy will trickle down into the whole production, through the rest of the team. So it was a lesson in working really fast, and it was a lesson in making sure you bring some good energy and good vibes to your work, because people actually work harder and work better. This myth of like punishing people to get the best out of them is, I feel like I learned early on that that's bullshit. You know, working with Aaron, working with Michael, working with Chris Morris, you can get great stuff out of people by leading with a sense of play and collaboration.
That's funny. I was going to move on to Four Lions and Chris Morris next, because that sounds on paper like a film that really shouldn't work.
I didn't think it was. I didn't think it was a film that would work because, you know, I turned it down when you offered it to me, because I just thought, man, I don't really want to. This is like fatwa bait. You know, not really. But also, more importantly, it wasn't so much fear of people's reaction. It was just my own. I'd set these filters on my career myself quite intentionally when I joined the profession of, I don't want to play like terrorists, and I don't want to, you know, add to that narrative that stereotypes us. And luckily, I'd kind of got to know Chris over a period of a couple of years of him developing it. Anyone who knows Chris knows how meticulous he is in developing these, you know, different, all these projects that he works on. And he reached out to me after Post 9/11 Blues, after he saw that, and said, look, I'm making a film about this stuff, you know. And And we just would meet up every few months and have a chat. Every few months we'd meet up and we'd just have a chat. And I just thought, like, this guy is just like my mate, and every now and again I might put him in touch with someone I know up north or something, and every time he'd come back knowing more than me about what it is to be a Muslim in Britain, almost, you know, outside of the lived experience of it. And so when he gave me this, I'd forgotten there was even really a film at play. I just thought he's off on his little missions. And then he gave me this script and I read it. I was like, this is funny, but nah, I'm not really looking to be in it. And then he met up with me and said, listen, people are going to be rooting for these characters. This is not, he said something like, look, when you make someone laugh, you bypass their brain. And just trust me. And honestly, I had my massive doubts about everything he was saying. I just trusted him. You know, I just thought, I really like this guy, man. I've got to know him a little bit over the last few years. I kind of just trust him. I trust his energy, and all right, let's do it. You know what I mean? Let's give it a go. And again, it was an example of how play and kind of inclusivity and collaboration can yield such great results. And we were so lucky to have Jesse Armstrong and Sam Bain on that film, you know, who wrote Peep Show. And I think it's kind of interesting now, you know, whether people would say Four Lions shouldn't be allowed to be made. You know, you've got a white director and two white writers doing a terrorism comedy. I've got to say, at the time, Chris had tremendous challenges getting it made. And Film 4 didn't want to make it for a long time. And then in the end, he did a kind of fundraiser online. He said, you can be an extra in a film if you give me 20 quid. And that kind of started it up again. But it is interesting because I do think, you know, some people who do, and I think rightly kind of say nothing about us without us, you know. Don't make a film about Muslims, you're not Muslim, your writers are Muslim, all that kind of stuff. I get it. There's been so many, once bitten, twice shy, there's been so many ridiculous portrayals that's done lasting damage, you know, from 24 to Homeland, and, you know, 100 years of that, you know. And there's that book and film, Real Bad Arabs, and it's about how over 100 years of cinema, it's like 99.9% of portrayals are all negative. Of Muslims in Hollywood, but I do think that Four Lions is an example of someone who was humble, who did the work in a really dedicated way, who was research led, and who was collaborative with his, you know, brown cast, and I think that film is it's just kind of stood the test of time, you know, and is so many people's favorite film. It's kind of crazy. People stop me and say, that is my favorite film, which is such an honor to have been part of it. But again, it's down to kind of Chris's genius, perseverance, and humility that I think he got the results he did.
Yeah, for me, I remember when I watched that film, I was on a roller coaster ride of like laughing and then not being sure about it. And then that ending was just incredible. It blew me away. I was like, this is such a brave and fulfilling film, and is an artist who's willing to go to places that you're not supposed to be allowed to go. And I was interested in what you just said there about him being a white director and brown stories, because there's two sides to that. There is the access side, which I think is the important question of, it wouldn't be an issue if enough people from different backgrounds were given access and allowed through the gates. You've been a big champion in that. Obviously, you did the famous House of Commons speech in 2017. And how important has that been a role for you in your career, and you're recognizing that? Because you really veered away from that. When we talk about a little bit of your later work, it's got nothing to do with race or identity or stereotyping, yet you've decided to champion and take a cause up for other people. And I'm sure people like me are very grateful for you doing that.
Oh, thanks, man. I mean, I guess for me, in terms of my work, like, I often say that it kind of goes in stages, right? So you have first the stereotype or the caricature of the terrorist or the cab driver or whatever, and then you go to the roles and stories that are subverting the stereotypes, which is stuff like The Road to Guantanamo or Four Lions or Brits. That's kind of taking place on a landscape of, say, the War on Terror or that kind of stuff, but it's subverting those dominant narratives. It's kind of, jumping on the bandwagon to like overturn it, and then I say you kind of got that third stage, which is where the character and the story are not primarily defined by any of those kind of capital C cultural issues. And I think that there's just been an evolution in where we've been at as a society, quite frankly, and as an industry, in that more of those stage 3 kind of roles have become available to someone like me. So I've been able to, and it's, it's down to the progressiveness of people like Kathy Kennedy at Lucasfilm, who says, we're going to reboot Star Wars. It's going to be John Boyega and Daisy Ridley and Oscar Isaacs at the heart of it, and, when it comes to casting Rogue One, it's people like me and, Donnie Yen is in it, and it has that kind of, that representative kind of casting. And so I think there's just been that evolution, being lucky to have stuck around in the business long enough to have seen those things open up and then being able to kind of step into those roles. But I would say that, there are many different ways of kind of representing. One of them is about doing specifically kind of a film that is specifically about your culture and your identity. And to me, that is still an important part of what I want to explore and contribute, which is, what I'm doing with a film like Mogul Mowgli, or that's kind of often what I do in my music. Another one is about stepping into a role that normally might not have been played by someone who looks like you, and stretching culture in that way. Like you have in Star Wars, for example, or say, in Shifty, where his cultural background is not intimately tied to, to the story in itself. But I also think, and I'm thinking more and more about how you get past that burden of representation and how you kind of move from representing to just presenting yourself, to actually putting down the question of like, what do I think, these imaginary people in my head that I'm kind of repping would want to see? What do I wish existed when I was a bit younger? These are all thoughts that have always entered my mind and informed my choices, and they continue to. But at the same time, I am, trying to kind of free myself of that a little bit and kind of, liberate myself from some of those considerations, not because I don't want anything to do with that mission of stretching culture, but that I think that actually liberating yourself in your creative freedom does contribute to capital L liberation, Teju Cole wrote a little bit about this, and writing about what he thinks people want from their art. And he had this interesting quote that I think, above all, people want to feel a sense of freedom, feel that the artists created this freely, unapologetically, that their sense in freedom in making that work jumps off the page. If you look at a Basquiat, for example, some of his work will be more explicitly kind of political, like it's one of it specifically about the film industry. It's called Hollywood Africans. But a lot of it is it's political in the sense that it's subversive, in that it does its own thing, in that it kind of, is not a slave to the norms or the creative norms of the time. And so I think that's I'm thinking more and more about how representing is not about representing your people or a community, which is always doomed to fail and is always going to be simplistic. It's always going to be a distillation of a complex experience to something singular, and thinking more about just presenting your personal experience unapologetically. And I think I'm seeing that in my work. I feel like it's coming from a more personal place now.
Well, it's interesting what you're talking about, freeing yourself and that liberation, is that really does seem to ring true of Nightcrawler, where you were given this part which really doesn't seem like the main part of the film, yet you were so free and gave that role and of the hustler wanting to step forward such dynamicism that everybody, then you were on the lips of America after Nightcrawler. Were you surprised by that?
You know, it's interesting. I think people notice the performance a bit, but you kind of often, I think if you don't fit the mold, you don't get it the first time of asking. You have to like come back and keep coming back. And I think the good thing about Nightcrawler is it was my first American job, and people saw it and people were into it, and that was cool. But I then didn't get any more work for like a year and a half. And I was kind of thinking, shit, like, I don't know if I can carry on doing this. I've just been kind of broke for a really long time now. And it was then that the night of, was rebooted. And it was like this lifeline of like, what, we're going to be able to go back and shoot that show that we thought would never happen because obviously James Gandolfini tragically passed away. But, speaking more directly to the experience of Nightcrawler, I think what that shares is something that Four Lions has, which is this kind of tonal ambiguity. And I'm really drawn to films that you're not really sure exactly what, is this a love story or is this a horror? Is this a comedy or is this a thriller? I really love those kind of stories, and I think Four Lions has that, and I think Nightcrawler also has that. It's down to Dan Gilroy's incredible writing. And also I'm really grateful to Jake in that, he was very involved in the casting of that film and gave me a shot, really. I just had reached almost the end of the road, a little bit for myself of I'd kind of done these films. I'd done Shifty, I'd done Four Lions, I'd done Road to Guantanamo, I'd done stuff that had made an impact, I'd done Brits. These were all things that people talked about. They were on billboards. People were writing huge op-eds about Brits when it came out. It was the first kind of TV show of its time that was talking about what it was. All Road to Guantanamo, all of these things. And yet I couldn't quite find a way of migrating from the kind of the politics column to the arts column. You know what I mean? Because of this work that was, culturally relevant and entertaining, was still kind of looked at through this kind of social commentary lens or, anthropological kind of thing. And honestly, I just hit a massive glass ceiling in the UK. They just weren't those jobs for me. Once you've kind of done a couple of those independent movies, there's no next rung for you. The next rung is these big scale period dramas that you can't be in. So there was nowhere really to go for me here in the UK. I'd really hit the end of the road, which was quite sad and quite telling. And I think that it's still true for a lot of people here, to be honest. And then it was only once I got to the States, it was like, all right, I'm going to start again now. You are kind of starting all over again in America. And I always think it's quite telling how quick America is to kind of, create opportunities for new talent compared to the UK. Of course, it's a different scale and size of industry, but I do think there is, there's just a different way of embracing new talent, I think.
I think you're totally right, because obviously I can speak from the other side, from the arts perspective, and how hard it was to try and say, hey, there's Riz Ahmed, we should cover him. And it's like, why? Because they haven't watched the shows or the films because of it's hit the zeitgeist, but on the news pages, not the arts world. And then if you don't have that build-up, you can't get pushed into the right direction to get the other roles. And it's the same as a writer. I don't think if I didn't do Spike Lee's biography, who was an American who gave me a chance, that I would have had the possibility of writing for national papers for as long as I did.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? It's just find out with so many people, speaking to Idris, Dan Kaluuya. I remember Idris once said to me, he was like, you got to get to America, man. And I was like, man, what are they going to do with someone like me over there, man? And he just said, limit yourself not. You know, I remember him saying that to me, you know, in the Globe at Notting Hill, and he was like, you got to get out there. And I just got Nightcrawler. I was like, all right, let's try this. But I do think it is quite telling, you know, there's a very short ladder, I think, for people of color in the UK. I think that's changing. But often you need to kind of like switch over to the States to come back to get to that, you know, next level of having more opportunities.
But then you did really hit the next level. You had like obviously the Rogue One, and you had a bit in part in Jason Bourne, but the connection with Steve Zalian, he really seemed to be able to bring out the best of me. And that first episode of The Night Of, I remember, just completely blew my socks off. What was your discussions like, and how did you feel about Naz and playing that character?
You know, I'm really lucky to have been a part of that. It's just one of those projects that I think just, you know, everyone was talking about it, and it was just so well made. And that's down to Steve Zalian's really perfectionism. You know, he was a stickler for detail down to the minutiae, which can be intimidating sometimes to work with, but ultimately you're really grateful for, you know, for him being such a kind of specific sculptor of each moment, each scene. And, you know, it has to be said, such a, you know, used to come from an editing background as well. And, you know, anything that worked in that performance is down to his edit, you know, as well, because it has to be said, I felt a little bit crushed under the pressure of that role, if I'm honest. I felt like, you know, I was going to meet people in Rikers Island prison. I was meeting people whose lives had been stolen from them due to wrongful convictions. And I was volunteering at the South Asian Youth Action, you know, kind of youth center in Queens in New York to be around that experience. And I was working out 3 hours a day because I had to kind of gain the size while we were filming. Often you gain at the front. Now I've learned you gain weight at the front, you shoot that out, then you have a break and you drop, and this is not what that was. This is while we were filming. And it was just all just really intense, and Steve was this perfectionist. And honestly, I was doing some really bad work in those first, you know, I just couldn't just be there. My head was just in the, you know, and also being aware that, you know, James Gandolfini, who's an actor I loved, he initially was in this show and he died, and sometimes you just get in your head and the pressure is so intense. And so I'm lucky really to have been in the hands of Steve Zalian, and also Jane Tranter as a producer who brought that story over, who's very, very supportive when I was kind of going through it a bit. And I would say finally, John Turturro taught me a lot, like a huge amount on that. I said to him right at the start, listen, man, you're a legend. Tell me anything you want. You want to come and say something in my ear, direct me? You want to tell me some shit? You can do it. I'm telling you right now. And he was very gracious with how often he came in and talked to me, but he did talk to me and he helped me. And he you know, he's got an amazing way about him where he kind of conveys deep wisdom in this very unpretentious way, you know, often through like kind of meatball sauce recipe metaphors. Like, you know, talk about, listen, when you're cooking meat, you got to just tenderize it and put it in the oven, okay? So just tenderize the meat and then just be in the scene, just be in the oven. And you'd be like, that's actually genius, you know? And so I was really grateful for him. He taught me a tremendous amount. Yeah.
How much can you assess your own performance and have that self-awareness? And are there moments where you're in the zone?
I think it's hard, isn't it, to watch yourself objectively. I know that some actors don't watch themselves. I think they're probably wise to. I felt that I needed to start watching myself at one point because I felt that directors held me to a lower standard than I was holding myself. And people were willing to move on when I was not willing to move on. And people were like, that's good enough. And I was like, that is not good enough. We need to go back and we need to do that. And it also came from, I guess, like working on sets that were quite small and there being a kind of open vibe, you know, on those sets. For example, Ben Drew being really welcoming in terms of like helping me in the filmmaking process, allowing me to help him and to kind of talk to each other through that for Ill Manners. So that's what, and also I guess I've just always been fascinated with the actual filmmaking process. So I'm interested to go to the monitor. So it's that, those two things that kind of led me to start watching, just a curiosity about filmmaking and a kind of perfectionism really that was probably unhelpful in many ways, but it's where my head was at for many years. And I guess it is really hard to watch objectively, but I think if you can try and watch it like you're watching someone else, then I think it can sometimes be helpful, you know? Sometimes if you're just not getting something, it's easier to just go to the monitor and have a look rather than put a director through the headache of trying to tactfully translate how badly you're screwing it up in a nice way to you. Just go and have a look at it. So I don't know, I feel that it's helpful, but whereas before I used to try and watch everything, now I'm trying to limit it a little bit. And I think that actually it's about trust, isn't it? It's about having faith in your collaborator and just jumping.
What's interesting is throughout this whole time, you were also carrying on your music career. And in the last year with two films, Sound of Metal and Mogul Mowgli, which is playing at the LFF this year, you have managed to marry performances that have tapped into your musical skills as well as your acting skills and brought out, for me, I love these two performances that you bring out in both Mogul Mowgli and Sound of Metal. What is it about that marriage of music and the artist and acting that you tapped into to bring this confusion and this struggle, and how that taps into society and social life?
Yeah, you know, I was talking before about how I think I want to move from like trying to represent others to kind of trying to present myself and my own personal experience, and how I think that's creatively liberating for me, but also more liberating on a wider context, you know, socially. Just it's inspiring to see someone be themselves and share their experience. I was so inspired by Michaela Cole's show recently, I May Destroy You, which was so unapologetically personal and intimate and specific to her experience. And I guess, you know, I took on Sound of Metal and Mogul Mowgli from that mindset, I guess, from the perspective of feeling that, you know what, I want to start creating from a more personal place. You know, I'd gone on a run of kind of doing a couple of these studio films. I did Star Wars and I did Jason Bourne, and I'd come off the kind of, you know, the night of promo carousel, and it all felt quite big. You know, I did Venom, and I wanted to kind of get back to that feeling of Shifty and of Four Lions and Road to Guantanamo, really, where it does feel a bit more smaller, where you have a lot less time and a lot less leeway to make mistakes, but that tension and that pressure actually forces everyone to focus in a different way, and where it's a bit more collaborative, basically. You know, it's not done by committee as much. It's about your collaboration with that director. And that's how Sound of Metal found me. And I have to say, you know, both Sound of Metal and Mogul Mowgli are related to them because, yeah, I guess, you know, they're about musicians who are kind of workaholics and who kind of are humbled by circumstances outside of their control. They're about control freaks who realize that you can't control everything. And that speaks a little bit to my experience. You know, I spoke about my perfectionism and decided to control stuff and spinning all these different plates and always being busy. Those moments in life where I've been kind of brought to my knees and made to kind of pause and realize that actually you don't control shit. And actually the things that you've been chasing might not matter that much. That was where my head was at that time. You know, having done a run of those big films, kind of really exhausted myself physically and health-wise at that point. Both sound and metal really spoke to me, you know, and I think it'll speak to a lot of people in this context of the pandemic, you know, workaholism being laid bare by a health crisis that makes you reassess everything and puts you in a kind of purgatory, a lockdown. That's what the arc is of Sound of Metal, but it's also the arc of Mogul Mowgli. And so, yeah, it was just this kind of year or so, year and a half, 2 years where I was like, I just want to go to the most personal place. And this is where my head is at. And I just, you know, decided to explore those themes twice. But it's interesting, isn't it? Like they're very, very different films. You know, on paper, if you were to kind of distill it down to bullet points, they sound very similar, but I don't think that does them justice. And it's in some ways a kind of a lesson, isn't it? It's like so much of it's about the execution, the tone, the filmmaker. The whole thing they feel like very different films, even though in terms of their point of origin, I was exploring very similar things in both of them.
And what I've also, in terms of Mogul Mowgli, I really loved was from my own experience of being a Pakistani growing up in Britain. The film really taps into that experience of double consciousness, of code switching, in a very intelligent and esoteric fashion. It doesn't tell it to me as a drama. It tells it to me more in the abstract. And that was very important to why I loved that film. You were heavily involved in the creation of this film. What did you know that it needed to push it in that direction?
Well, that's Bassam who pushed it in that direction. You know, Bassam pushed it in that direction because his sensibility is to kind of veer towards the esoteric, to lean towards the mystic. And I think mine is more to lean towards the comical and the clear, you know. And I think there was a healthy balance between us both in kind of making sure that things felt mysterious without feeling too confusing. But it's interesting because, you know, I co-wrote the film with Bassam, and we came up with a story together. We put a lot of our lives and our experiences into that film as brown artists who feel like they're representing people, but feel crushed and paralyzed by that and restricted by it, but also animated by that sense of mission. But actually, you're talking about repping your people. When was the last time you spent any time with your family? You're just always out there on the road, like trying to feed your ego and get all this validation. You don't do it for your people. Your people are at home missing you, you know? And so we just put a lot of that into the film and explored a lot of that. And when you realize it's like, in some ways, the more personal your work gets, the more you realize you can't just simplify it. Yeah. You know, you have to be esoteric. When it's someone else's experience, it's a fictional experience, we're very quick to like simplify it. But when it's your own, you realize that the complexity of it defies neat categorization. And so it started getting weird. You know, we started building up this universe of references from our own cultural heritage and our own experience, and we didn't have the time to explain them to people. We just hope that people would get it emotionally and could run with it. So I think its esoteric tone is a result of Bassam's sensibility, but also the realization that the complexity of your authentic experience can only be communicated through the indirect, through metaphor, through magical realism rather than social realism. And also because magical realism is our vocabulary as South Asians. You know, we come from a culture that's steeped in mythology, in spirituality, in revelation. And so we wanted to bring our own grammar to the way that film was made. We wanted to kind of explore what brown cinema in the diaspora feels like. It shouldn't just feel like, you know, British social realism with brown characters in it. It needs to be told in a different way.
Yeah, it's so interesting. When I've got a final question, which is telling this story in a different way, and we're at the London Film Festival. How important was it to tell this story in London? I know it starts in New York, but it feels like a British story to me with universal themes.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. We were going to make a lot of the film in Pakistan at one point, and what we realized is that was a cop-out. It wasn't about reconnecting to a place. It was about reconnecting to people. One of those people is your dad. One of those people is this old Qawwali singer who, even though you dismiss as a kind of like weirdo, has actually gifted you the space to be an artist and gifted you this legacy of like subversive creativity. Another one of those people that the film is about connecting to is yourself, your core self, underneath the mask of, you know, the performer. And so it was about connecting to people, and those people and that kind of complex mosaic of different characters, they all exist in London. You know, there is a richness to the mongrel experience of London, you know, the mishmash of it culturally, but also the kind of like the fact that as diaspora, we do live in a kind of no man's land. That no man's land, that blank slate almost feels like that's a really daunting, but also really inviting canvas for us as artists, you know, to make our identity from the old and the new. That is the project that is at hand for us, to kind of build our world and tell our story and build it through collage from, not quite from scratch, but, you know, from all these things that we've inherited. And to do that, otherwise other people will tell our story and they'll tell it their way. And so something about kind of making a home in no man's land, making a home through fiction, you know, making, you know, 1950s Pakistan in Hounslow, joining those diaspora dots, you know, it just felt kind of exciting and inspiring, and something that on a personal level would be quite healing for us. So that's why we did that.
Riz, thank you so much. You've been so generous with your time and your thoughts, and I can't wait for the next stages in your already excellent career. I can just see it going better and better. Thanks so much for this.
So much, man. Thanks for such thoughtful questions, and thank you for being there every stage along the way to check in and talk to, and always being so supportive and helping to frame these stories. You know, it's so important we tell these stories, that there are critical thinkers and critics and journalists and writers like you who can really try and understand and get under the hood of what we're trying to do, and be that bridge to audiences. So thank you, man.
Thanks, man. Cheers.